The following program is being presented as Channel 11 continues its dedication to the family. We invite you to join us with your thoughts and feelings about the war in the Persian Gulf by calling 868-1380 right now.
Gives you a good feel for life here when you're over here. Makes you appreciate some of the simplest things in life, for sure. Cold water, a shower, real food, someplace you sleep that you can't throw the floor at your friend. Lots of stuff.
Good evening. I'm Bill Humphreys. For the past 15 days, people have been talking about the war in the Persian Gulf, and chances are you've talked about it yourself today. You may not have come up with any great solutions, but just by talking and listening, I'm sure that you felt better for getting whatever it was that was bothering you off of your chest. Well, tonight, New Hampshire Public Television is here to listen to you, and we want you to call in and share your feelings, your observations, your criticisms, whatever, about the war in the Persian Gulf. Not only is there an audience throughout New England ready to listen with you tonight, but we also have some very esteemed guests with me here in the studio, and I'd like to introduce a few of them to you right now. Sitting to my right is retired U.S. Army Colonel Richard Erickson, who was retired recently, I believe, after 27 years of military service, which included a command of a unit in Vietnam. He was also a staff officer at the Pentagon and Army headquarters. Welcome to you. Across the studio from him is Dr. Alasdair Drysdale, who received his degree in Middle Eastern Studies from the University of Durham, England, and his PhD from the University of Michigan. He is the author of a book on political geography of the Middle East. He spent his childhood in Libya with his family, as his father was a British diplomat, and he had the fortune, I don't know if you would call it that or not, to be in Jordan during the Iraq invasion on August 2nd last summer. Sitting next to the doctor is also Dr. Joshua Meyrowitz, professor of communication at UNH, author of the award-winning book No Sense of Place, and in addition to many scholarly articles, he has written for Newsweek, Psychology Today, and TV Guide, and has been a guest on many radio and television talk shows. We welcome all of you to our show this evening. We have a fourth guest who will be joining us shortly, and she is Sue Mautz, who is a private practice therapist in Portsmouth, and she'll be here to answer some of your calls and hopefully put them in perspective. The number that you see on your screen is 868-1380. We invite you to pick up the phone and call us right now with whatever might be on your mind. While we're waiting for the phone calls to come in, gentlemen, I have a personal connection with this incidents that we're calling the war in the Persian Gulf. I have a nephew who is on the USS Sylvania. It's a supply ship serving the other vessels in the Gulf. We haven't heard very much about the Navy's activity in the Gulf, and I have a personal concern about what kind of danger he may be in. Will we see naval activity coming in to play? Colonel, do you have any thoughts on where we might be going with that?
Well, the Navy has played rather a prominent role.
All the other countries that are over there, those Arabs are only seeing what Saddam Hussein wants them to see. I really think the government should pull the plug on CNN.
I feel, Agnes, I get the feeling that you're very disturbed for the welfare of Peter Arnett and the other journalists that are over there.
Yes, I was very upset for him, and I was upset for the others, and there's still some missing.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that the CNN should just absolutely pull the plug. Last night I watched Larry King live. He had a representative, I believe he was vice president of CNN, and they asked him the question. Some caller called in and asked him if they were getting paid by the Iraqi government, and his response was yes.
Josh, you have any comments?
Well, I think that I'm not sure that your perspective on this is the only one that reasonable people could take, but I think that you've hit upon something that's very significant, and that is that there's something very new going on here with global communications. And we often think of global communications as expanding the possibilities and opening up information to people. And yet I think the paradox that we're seeing is that there's a lot of concern, such as yours, of who's watching, and of how even people who are informing the American public on CNN from this country about what might happen in the Gulf are unwittingly being consultants to Saddam Hussein, giving him ideas perhaps of options to take. And that in this global arena, we're not sure whether we want to know more information or whether we want to in some way censor the information and limit it. But at the same time, we do have the ideals in our country that we say we're fighting for, of open information and of knowledge. And I think that perhaps we're grown up enough to realize and understand that what we see from Iraq is censored by Iraqi military, just as the information that we receive from Saudi Arabia about our military activities is also censored by the United States military, and just as the information that we receive from Israel is cleared by Israeli censors. And so I think that one could actually argue that perhaps we need more information rather than less information.
Well, it brings up a good point. How much information are we getting? Are we getting enough information to give us a true picture, a perspective that we can trust?
Yeah, I don't think so. But I think that a lot of the focus has been on the battle between the press and the military right now about what should or should not go out. And the press very much wants to be at the front line to see the casualties, to communicate that, to communicate the horror of war. And I'm not sure that one needs necessarily to take one of those two sides, to take the side of the military and say that it has to be completely censored, to take the side of the press that they have to be able to show the body bags. I think that neither of those perspectives necessarily represents the needs and wants of the American public, which may need to have a different type of view of the war. I think the problem is not so much that there are all these journalists over there now who aren't getting access to the front, there are 800 of them, but that none of those journalists were in the Middle East a year ago.
We have some journalists that have evidently been taken captive that are now prisoners of war. Hello, line 4?
Yes, so the point I'd like to make is regarding the protests I've been seeing on TV regarding the war in the Gulf. And I'd like to say that I do have a cousin over there in the 82nd Airborne. What bothers me is it seems like they oversimplify the whole issue as to why we're there. I think what we're seeing now with Iraq releasing the oil into the Gulf, the stockpiling of chemical and biological weapons, as far as I'm concerned, we have a moral obligation along with the rest of the coalition to be over there. And it goes way beyond protecting our own oil interests in the Gulf. And I just wanted to make that point that I think the protesters are oversimplifying it, and the media's coverage of it is really making it a lot less of an issue than I think it really has to be. And that's the point that I'd like to make.
Okay, thank you very much, John. I appreciate that. As we get into answering that question for you, we have a piece of tape that I think might be appropriate to look at. Recently, New Hampshire Journal's reporter Rod Paul did an interview with Senior Senator Warren Rudman from the state capitol in Washington, D.C., and he happened to mention a couple of quotes about why we are in this war. Perhaps we should take a look at that tape right now, then we can complete the answer afterwards.
How do you answer those, some in this state, many in this state, who say this is a fight over oil, and ask if Kuwait is worth 1,000 deaths or even 10,000 deaths?
I think for those who want to characterize this as a fight about low gasoline prices is to trivialize the issue. There are several key issues involved. Let me take them in order and very briefly. First, and I think foremost, this is a powerful country, the United States of America, that stands for democracy and human rights all over the globe. Here in this area, you had a total violation of international law. The murder, the rape, the pillaging of an innocent people, the annexation of a weak state. This is what we saw in the world in the 18th and 19th centuries. In the 20th century, we saw it in the 1930s. Now we're at the end of that, we hoped, and yet we see it all over again. To ignore it is to invite disaster around the world. Secondly, and I think very importantly, the bottom line is that we in fact depend, the free world, on about half of our energy, most of the world about 80%, from the Persian Gulf. If Saddam Hussein were to control either by military force or by intimidation the flow of oil and the price of oil, then the industrial democracies would crumble. That would be something that is totally unacceptable. And finally, and I think most importantly, this nation has stood for 2 centuries now for freedom and self-determination. And since we are a superpower, there are prices that go with it. For those who protest, I understand them full well, but I would make the general observation that if we wish to relinquish our position as a superpower, then much of what we call America will go with it. It's a return to the isolationism of the 1930s. It didn't work then. It won't work now. And for that reason, reluctantly, based on my own experiences as a young man, very reluctantly, I voted to support the president.
Isolationism of the 1930s that we're reverting to. Where do we go from here? And in response to John's question.
Well, I think John is certainly correct when he suggests that this is not a simple problem. I suspect that many of the people who are protesting this war also don't believe that it's simple. Senator Rudman just mentioned that one of the reasons for our presence in the Gulf is a concern about human rights, and another is a need to uphold a principle that territorial aggression should not be allowed to pay. I personally am confused about the inconsistency with which those principles have been upheld. For example, Saddam Hussein has been in power since 1979, and his record is very well known. Anyone who has even a passing acquaintance with Iraq is familiar with a really exceptionally brutal human rights record. That's not in dispute. The fact is, however, that for much of the 1980s, we implicitly supported Iraq during its war with Iran. We gave tacit approval to its attack on Iran in 1980. I think we can see many examples around the world of territorial aggression that haven't met with this kind of response. For example, Turkey's invasion of Cyprus in 1975, Indonesia's absorption of Timor, King Hassan of Morocco's absorption of the Spanish Sahara, South Africa's invasion of Angola, China's annexation of Tibet. So I think many people are very concerned about what it is about this particular case that's required us to respond in this way.
Okay. We'd like to move right into a call from Lee on line 4 from Walpole. Good evening. On how the media should be covered. When we look at what the media is doing with the war, what should we be feeling? What should we be doing? Both Sue and Josh.
Well, you know, I think there's so much focus on whether to show what are the lessons of Vietnam. In other words, should you show the casualties and so forth. But I think the lesson that the military has learned from Vietnam is control the coverage as much as possible. Don't allow the horrors of war to overshadow what the claimed goals are. And I think that, you know, one can see how the suffering in an individual incident may not represent a larger picture, but I think there are other lessons to learn from Vietnam, and that is how even in all its self-proclaimed glory, the press really let us down in Vietnam much earlier than it's often blamed on. And that is one of the justifications we were told for going to Vietnam was on August 4th, 1964, when the New York Times told us that red PT boats fired on 2 of our destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin, who were on routine patrol in international waters. Lyndon Johnson went on the air, announced airstrikes in North Vietnam, and that was the beginning for most of us of the Vietnam War, our experience of it. There are a few problems with that story, though, that were never really corrected. One was that the 2 destroyers were not on routine patrol. This is, by the way, in the Pentagon Papers, the government's own documents. They were there to stimulate North Vietnamese radar so they'd know how to pick the targets. Also, they weren't really in international waters. They were in the waters that were claimed as territorial waters by North Vietnam, the same number of miles that Johnson's home state of Texas claimed. Third, Simultaneous, South Vietnam was running commando raids into North Vietnam, and North Vietnam thought these were the escort vessels. And fourth, and most significant, well, maybe not most significant, but most dramatic, was that right after announcing that they thought they were under attack, the guys on the boat started saying, well, maybe we're not really under attack because we don't seem to be taking any hits and we don't seem to be hitting anything. And they almost blew each other out of the water at one point, and when the darkness lifted, they realized that they probably had misread their own sonar equipment, and they actually wasn't an attack that day. And so the question is, where were the media there? Should we really be focusing now on the question of, do you show the horrors of war, not show the horrors of war? Should we be asking, why do the journalists seem to follow around the State Department spokesperson, the Secretary of Defense, the head of the troops? Why aren't there other journalists who are looking into other aspects of the situation? And maybe now it's too late. Maybe we're in a battle now. Maybe we just have to all rally around the flag. I don't think that that's the case. But certainly over the last few months, journalists should have been asking more about why the people on the street, even in the governments that support us, support the United States, seem to be against the United States and for Saddam Hussein. What is the history in the region? What is going on there? What are the in the whole Gulf crisis? We haven't heard a thing about the other Gulf, the Gulf Oil Company, and the other 6 major oil companies. Shouldn't we know something about the history of that region? Why their resources are thought of as our resources? What are the feelings in the area? Who drew the boundaries around Kuwait? You know, it wasn't the Arabs, it was the British. How old is Kuwait? It's only 70 years old. Yeah. What human rights are we restoring in Kuwait? What human rights did they have there initially? And I think that journalists tend to do a terrible job at giving us any of those other perspectives. Those other perspectives may not be the correct perspective, they may not be the only perspective, but we ought to have them. Instead, we get a very simple fairy tale of good versus evil, and we think of ourselves wandering around the world as innocents and being provoked to the point of attack, when we've had major involvements in these countries, and where we are not just reacting to aggression, but may be in a complex pattern, almost as complex as a bad marriage, where you can't easily attribute the fault entirely to one side or the other.
Mm-hmm. When we're watching television and getting all this filtered news, Sue, what should we be gathering? What should we be understanding from all this? Should we be believing what we're being presented?
I wouldn't think so. But I think the issue is more what happens to the people that are watching it and the children that are watching it particularly. Personally, one thing that happens for me too is I find myself, as the male reporters are on, I'm tensing, and as the female reporters come on, I'm relaxing. That's just a thing I have been noting. And
I don't really know, but I think one of the questions we have to ask is what we mean by a long conflict or a long war. As I have,
6 months versus the history of Vietnam.
Well, let me answer it in this way. The 1967 Arab-Israeli war lasted for 6 days. But here we are 24 years later.
Or did it, yes.
Here we are 24 years later, still dealing with the aftermath. Mm-hmm. I think it's analogous to that. I think on the battlefield it may well be a very short war, but the long-term political consequences, I think, could be with us for decades.
Mm-hmm.
I'm also very concerned about how the discussion on television, and we fall into it a little bit as well, seems to turn to this little pragmatic discussion of how the war will be ended quickly with a very narrow definition of the war. One thing that Alasdair, I'm sure, I know he knows, but didn't mention about Iran that would, I think, change some people's perception of why the Iranians hate us so much, is that this dictator that was in power for 26 years didn't get there all by himself. In 1953, the CIA organized a coup and overthrew an elected government in Iran of the nationalist Mossadegh, installed the Shah of Iran, and trained his secret police. Also, the name of the person who played a very key role in that, especially in training the police, was H. Norman Schwarzkopf, not the person not the H. Norman Schwarzkopf who's commanding our troops right there, but his father. And Norman himself, young Norman, was living in Tehran when he was age 12. Now, these type of striking pieces of information seem to be completely absent from the narrative, the stories that we get in journalism. And I feel that we need to know these things in order to understand the full context of our involvement there. And to leave those pieces out somehow makes it much more of a dangerous.
I'm interested to know what you think of our senior senator's remarks on what's going to happen after this war is over. Rod Paul did an interview with him, as we saw a little earlier. He had some comments about what's going to happen at the end of the war. We'll take a look at that right now. Many different ways to go about war. Penny on line 4 has perhaps an alternative. Good evening, Penny.
Well, I'm a little concerned about the fact that it seems to be a message of hopelessness and waiting that's given especially to high school and college-age boys about waiting for, if there's a draft, waiting to be sent to war to kill or be killed, but that's not the only alternative. As in Vietnam, there is the alternative of conscientious objecting. There is the alternative of making a stand for something other than killing.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering why that isn't emphasized more, especially by when Sue spoke of having children that age herself. I also do. And I'm not sure why we all feel like we need to be led like lambs to the slaughter.
Do you have any personal experience with conscientious objectors in your family, Penny?
No, I don't. I'm of the age where I was just slightly too young to have any friends who were Vietnam War veterans or of that age, but I do have sons, 19 and 20. And
would you encourage that with your sons?
You bet.
Very interesting. Comment?
I think what's interesting is what you said about the leading of the lambs. I think that an interesting thing happens, and that is that when you have a division in the feelings in the country about going to war, and then some decision is made, suddenly you find overnight, as seemed to be suggested in the polls, there was this massive swing. And some people who have studied this effect in polls in general elections and so forth have suggested that what happens is that it's not so much that there's a massive change in opinion, is that those who hold the opinion that they perceive to be the minority opinion, even if it's a slight minority opinion, start to feel that they can't say it anymore, that it's hard to say it. I've even found a few of the things that I've said on this show hard to say, and somehow feel it's more polite not to mention those things. I know there are some people who don't want to be interviewed, don't want to go on the air to say what the things they have to say, because they feel somehow it won't be accepted. And I think that it's become very difficult now to articulate any opposition to the policy that has been put into place. And it's difficult to articulate support for the soldiers by bringing them back alive, as opposed to support for them by sending them to kill or be killed. Mm-hmm. That somehow the debate is narrowed into a very limited range, such things as whether we should go into the land war right away or wait a while, whether we should try to drop nuclear weapons on Baghdad or just use conventional warfare, and that scares me.
Okay. We have David on line 3 from Deerfield. Good evening, David. Welcome to the program. Hello, David.
Hello?
Yes, good evening, David.
Oh, hi. I'd just like to make, my name's Chip, actually. That's why I didn't answer.
Oh, sorry, Chip.
Okay, I'd like to make a couple statements and then ask a question of the panel.
Sure.
First, I believe that we have to get beyond this idea of peace through strength. The missiles and artillery and the blood flowing in the desert will not bring about peace. What we have to learn and start practicing is there is no way to peace, that peace is the way. And now on the subject of oil, I'm not going to argue that oil is the only issue that is involved around this war, but it's obviously a part of it. And what we have to do as Americans is to make sure that this never happens again. We must begin to practice energy efficiency. Energy efficiency will end our crude addiction to oil. And the question I have for the panel is that if the Middle East was a field of broccoli instead of a field of oil, would we risk 500,000 American lives in the name of freedom and a new world order?
Absolutely not.
Certainly not.
But we are spilling or seeing oil spilled into the Gulf, which is destroying the environment, destroying the ability to grow broccoli. What do we do? What can we do with that? I mean, what is going to be the outcome of that spill?
Well, if I can just go back to something that the caller said that I think is awfully important for us to consider,
sure.
Which is that we can win this war militarily. Mm-hmm. Whether we can do so politically is a different matter altogether. And my deep concern from the very beginning has been not will we win this war. I think that seems like a foregone conclusion. But really what happens afterwards. I'm deeply concerned about the backlash. I'm deeply concerned about the turbulence and instability. I happen to believe that this was not the right course in this case. I think Iraq is a country that is landlocked to all practical purposes. It's surrounded on all sides by antagonistic neighbors. It's virtually completely dependent on oil exports for its wealth. This is one country where international sanctions ultimately could have worked. We did have a chance here to do something different, to do something in a new way in this new world order. Unfortunately, I think we've gone back to our old style of dealing with these problems, and I think, unfortunately, we're going to pay a price politically in the future.
Okay, we'll go back to line 4, if you will, please. Tracy, good evening.
All are going to be paying the price, as you were saying, not just politically, but personally, that, you know, the joy that we had that maybe we're going to have a new way of being in the world, as we saw the changes going on last year.
We only have a couple of minutes left here, and I'd like to ask if you have any thoughts of what's been garnered out of this evening's conversation with some of the people that have called in. Any new ideas or new perspectives?
It's interesting. Whenever I hear some of the calls and the thoughts about this, it keeps reminding me of one of my favorite shows as a child, which was the Kung Fu show. Mm-hmm. And some people have compared our military adventure in the Gulf to sort of Ramboism, but I think many people are abhorred by the notion, find the notion of Rambo abhorrent. But the notion of the Kung Fu character, if you recall, was a very gentle man, and he would speak about how he knew ways of healing, and how he would go out and try to help people when they were in trouble. And he would wander into this foreign territory, territory that was foreign to him, and he would find himself always in a situation where he would be provoked by some evil people. And of course, I and every other viewer waited for the provocation. That was the whole point of the show. God forbid a show should actually end peacefully. And we waited for that provocation by the terrible people, and then he would go into this incredible spasm of violence and wipe them all out. And I keep thinking that that myth is playing itself out here. I felt it myself when the attack began, certain kind of euphoria that something was being done. And I agree with the last caller about Saddam Hussein being quite a terrible person. And yet I worry about that Kung Fu myth in the sense that unlike the character in the Kung Fu series, the areas that we wander into are areas where we've had some interactions with for a long time, where we've helped the bullies in some cases come to power, where we've manipulated governments and resources, where we felt that the resources there somehow belong to us rather than the people who live there. And to keep holding on to this image that we are innocents and always do-gooders and always provoked and need to respond with a great overwhelming force, and that will solve the problem, and there'll be no more difficulties there, that when the character leaves that town, everything will be fine, I think is a dismal image, and one that's very, very incorrect.
Sue, any ways that we could offer suggestions to help cope with this emotionally? Or
again, I was thinking that we're talking in a way that, you know, what are people going to take away? You know, none of us are very excited about it, and yet we have to deal with this all the time. All I can keep saying is keep talking about it. Just like what Mr. Rogers said, speak of it, talk of it, find your voice, and whenever you're confused, speak the confusion.
Colonel, militarily?
Well, The military makes a distinction between information and intelligence. And it seems to me, and I've become something of a junkie, a news junkie, it seems to me we're getting a great deal of information and not perhaps a great deal of intelligence from what we're seeing. And it's what we've all spoken about. It's trying to take what's happening and putting it into a context, historical context, political context, what have you. I think that'll make it easier to deal with if we can understand why things are happening and how it came to be that we are where we are. I think that's comforting. I think the press and the whole media need to give the American people more credit than they're giving them. And although it may be too late now, I think the major networks and the major syndicates for publication ought to make a major investment in preparing reporters to do a proper job of covering an issue that's this complex. And it's not happening.
All their news consultants tell them that foreign news is a ratings buster, and so they don't spend much money on it.
Alasdair, conclusion?
Well, I think one of the things I've gotten out of this is a sense of the hunger still, tremendous appetite to know more about the situation, even although it seemed like we've heard nothing but the Gulf for the last 5 months. I think people are aware that there is something that they don't know that's important to know, some sense of context. There is a lot of bewilderment and puzzlement and just plain frustration about why we're in this situation.
Is there any way easy to tell, as you were saying, we don't know if we're going to win this politically or win it militarily, economically, sociologically? What's the measure? Do we have a measure?
I don't think we do. I think, unfortunately, we're going to have to wait a long time to really find out what the outcome of this war is.
Thank you very much. Before we go, I want to remind you that you have friends, if you have friends or relatives in active duty in the Persian Gulf, they are support groups available for you, and we'd like to present a short list of them to you now. And there are other support groups that are available too, so please check your local community services in the newspapers. They'll be able to help you find one. The war in the Persian Gulf is now 15 days old, and the range of feelings that you've shared with us tonight are feelings that can come to anyone who's been involved in a war. During the early days of World War II, right after a major battle, Winston Churchill was asked if this was the beginning of the end. He said no, but perhaps it is the end of the beginning. Perhaps we've reached that point on our journey too, as we continue day by day to weather the storm together. My thanks to my guests and to you. I'm Bill Humphreys. Good night.
getting back there. Goodbye, everyone, now. Love, Bruce.